8 trained bodyguards. One quiet contract worker nobody bothered to learn the name of. And a billion-dollar empire about to be stolen in front of 300 witnesses who couldn't do a thing to stop it. What happened inside the Meridian Grand Ballroom that night took exactly 24 seconds. 24 seconds that nobody in that room will ever forget, and that one man had been quietly preparing for since the moment he walked through the service entrance 6 hours earlier. This is the story of Nathan Cross, a widower, a father, a man the world stopped taking seriously a long time ago. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now because stories like this one don't show up in your feed twice. Like this video if Nathan's story hits you somewhere real, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one goes deep, and you don't want to miss a single second of it. The charity gala at the Meridian Grand Hotel had been planned for 11 months. Everything about it was designed to project power. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown skyline. The orchestra playing Ravel in the east corner of the ballroom. The tables set with linen that probably cost more per yard than Nathan Cross made in a day. Sterling Dynamics had done this every year for the past decade. A night where the company's wealth dressed itself up as generosity and invited the city's most important people to applaud it. Nathan arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon, 3 hours before the first guests would pull up in their cars. He wasn't supposed to be there that early. His contract said 6 o'clock, supplementary security, observation only, no authority to intervene in anything without direction from the lead team. He was a fill-in, a body placed in a corner to make a roster look full. The staffing agency had called him at 11:30 the night before because someone else had backed out, and Nathan had said yes because the flat rate would cover 2 months of his daughter's after-school program. That was the whole reason he was there. 2 months of afternoon care for a 7-year-old girl named Callie, who liked drawing horses and was currently missing her 2 front teeth. He showed his contractor badge to the service entrance guard, signed in, and walked the building. He did this because it was habit. Because 17 years of doing the most dangerous work the Navy asked of him had made it impossible to enter any space without first understanding it. Exits, sight lines, choke points, where the cameras pointed and, more importantly, where they didn't. He wasn't being paranoid. He was just built this way now. It was like checking that the stove was off before leaving the house. He couldn't not do it. The ballroom level occupied the 32nd floor. 2 main elevators, 1 service elevator at the north end, 4 emergency stairwells, 2 of which required a key card after 6 p.m. The kitchen and catering prep occupied the back third of the floor, separated from the event space by a long service corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and warming trays. Nathan walked all of it. He was checking the southwest stairwell door, testing whether it held open on its latch or swung closed on its own, when he noticed the first thing that didn't fit: a badge. The man wearing it was in a maintenance uniform, pushing a cart of folded tablecloths toward the freight elevator. Nothing unusual about that at 4:30 on Gala Day, except the badge was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not the kind of wrong that would catch most people's attention. The laminate had the right color, the right logo, the right font. But the corner security stamp, a small holographic seal that the Meridian used on all vendor credentials, was slightly off-center in a way that suggested it had been applied separately from the base card, rather than printed as part of it. Nathan watched the man until the elevator doors closed. Then he found the security office. The lead for the evening was a man named Gerald Fitch, mid-50s, former city police, the kind of man who had probably been very sharp 20 years ago and had spent the intervening time learning to coast. He was sitting behind a monitor bank eating a sandwich when Nathan knocked on the open door. "Fitch, I'm Cross. Contract fill-in for tonight." Fitch looked at him the way people look at someone handing out flyers on a street corner, a glance that didn't quite land. "Right, you're in the west corridor, 6 to close." I noticed a vendor badge that looks like it was modified. Guy in maintenance, 40s, gray cart, freight elevator maybe 3 minutes ago. Fitch chewed his sandwich. "Modified how?" "Holographic stamp looks applied after the fact. Probably a copy." "Probably." Fitch said it the way you'd say probably fine about leftovers you weren't sure about but were going to eat anyway. "We got 40 vendors in and out today. You want to flag every badge that looks a little rough? You're going to have a long afternoon. I'd like to pull the freight elevator footage from the last hour." Fitch looked at him for the first time like he was actually registering him. Not with respect, more like mild irritation. You're a contractor, Cross. Observation post, West Corridor. That's the assignment. Nathan looked at the monitor bank. 12 feeds. He counted 3 cameras that should have been covering vendor access points that were showing static. A gray, slightly grainy nothing instead of a live image. 3 of your cameras are down, he said. Maintenance is on it. Which maintenance? Because I'm not sure the man I saw was Cross. Fitch set down his sandwich. I appreciate the enthusiasm. I do. But I've been running security for Sterling Dynamics events for 6 years. I know what I'm doing. West Corridor, 6 o'clock. Nathan looked at the dead monitors for another 2 seconds. Then he nodded, said, understood, and left. He spent the next hour and 40 minutes doing things he wasn't authorized to do. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have looked like anything to anyone watching. He moved through the hotel the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance, taking up almost no space. He had a small notebook in his jacket pocket, the cheap kind you buy at a pharmacy, and he wrote things down in it, not in any code, just observations, times, locations, physical descriptions. 451, second modified badge. Catering staff, female, mid-30s, northeast service door. Badge stamp identical irregularity. 509. Guard rotation changed. South corridor post abandoned approx. 8 min before scheduled handoff. No radio check. 522. Ballroom AV team. 3 personnel. 1 does not interact with equipment. Position near main fuse panel. 538. Freight elevator used 6 times in 40 minutes. Manifest shows 2 authorized deliveries. By the time guests began arriving at 6 o'clock, Nathan had filled 4 pages. He went back to Fitch, laid the notebook on the desk, stood back and let the man read it. Fitch read exactly 1 page. Then he slid the notebook back across the desk. You wrote this in the last 2 hours? Yes. While you were supposed to be on your post. I covered the West Corridor. I also moved through the building. Without authorization. I observed. That's what the contract says. Fitch clasped his hands on the desk and looked at Nathan with an expression that was somewhere between bored and annoyed. Cross, I don't know what your background is. It's not relevant. But this kind of thing happens at every big event. Vendors cut corners on credentials. Guards take bathroom breaks. The AV guys stand around because half of them are just there to say they worked a fancy event. He pushed the notebook further toward Nathan's side of the desk. You've given me irregularities. What I need for an intervention is threat evidence. Do you have threat evidence? Nathan thought about the man by the freight elevator. The way he'd positioned himself at the back of the cart, hands visible but angled toward his body. The very specific way he'd looked at the camera housing above the elevator door. Not glancing up, but looking at it. The kind of look you give something you've already accounted for. Not yet, Nathan said. Then I suggest you return to your post and let my team do their jobs. Nathan picked up the notebook. He went back to the West Corridor. He stood at his post and watched the ballroom fill with people in expensive clothes who laughed too loud and air-kissed and clustered around the silent auction tables. He watched Victoria Sterling arrive at 6:42, a woman somewhere in her late 40s, dark-suited, composed in the particular way that came not from confidence, but from years of having to project it. She moved through the room the way people do when they've learned that every entrance is being evaluated. She had 4 personal security with her. Nathan watched all 4 of them. He made notes. 6:44. Sterling's team. Lead, tall, earpiece right. 2 flanking, 1 rear. Rear guard checked phone 3 times in 2 minutes. Not protocol. At 7:15, the auction opened and the orchestra shifted to something lighter. The room was at capacity. Nathan counted the exits from where he stood. Calculated how long it would take to clear 300 people through 4 stairwells if the elevators went down. He thought about Callie. She'd be in bed by now. His neighbor, Mrs. Adeyemi, watched her on evenings he had work, and she always made sure Callie was down by 8:30. He texted before going into the building. Be good. I love you. I'll be home by midnight. Callie had texted back a drawing she'd made on her tablet, a horse with an enormous head and 5 legs and what appeared to be a firefighter's hat. He was still smiling about it when the lights changed. Not an outage. Nothing so crude. Just a shift. The chandeliers dimming to a warmer, lower setting, the kind of thing a lighting technician would do during a program transition. Except no program transition had been scheduled for 7:19. Nathan had read the event timeline on the security briefing sheet. He was already moving when the first two men stepped out of the catering corridor. They were wearing Meridian security uniforms. Good ones. The details were right: the shoulder patch, the badge placement, the radio position. But they were moving wrong. Security personnel working a room like this moved with a specific kind of deliberate calm, always scanning outward. These two were moving inward, toward the center of the room, toward Victoria Sterling's table. Nathan counted. 1, 2. Then two more from the north entrance. Then one emerging from behind the silent auction display. Then two from the east side near the AV station. Then one more who'd been standing near the bar for the past 40 minutes, who Nathan had clocked at 7:08, but hadn't been able to place until this exact moment. 8. 8 people in Meridian uniforms forming a loose perimeter around Victoria Sterling's position, and every person in the ballroom was either oblivious or frozen. In that particular way, humans freeze when the situation stops making sense to them, and they're waiting for someone else to react first. Nathan was crossing the floor. He wasn't running. Running in a crowded room was how you triggered a stampede and got people hurt in the exits. He was moving fast and direct, using the gaps between tables, watching the 8-person formation, and doing what he'd been trained to do, identifying the command node. There was always a command node. One person who was directing, even subtly. He found him in 4 seconds. The man at the east position, slightly behind the line of the others, who'd looked at his watch at the same moment the light shifted. A coordinator. Not a fighter. Probably the one with the communications. Nathan made a choice. He was 12 feet away when the lead man, the one who'd come out of the catering corridor first, put his hand on Victoria Sterling's shoulder and said something Nathan couldn't hear. Victoria had turned, and Nathan could see on her face that she was being very careful to control her expression, which meant she was scared. "Excuse me," Nathan said it at a volume that carried exactly as far as the immediate circle. He was already inside the perimeter. "There's a problem with the south stairwell. I need your team to—" The nearest man turned toward him, hand moving toward his jacket. Nathan had already calculated that. What happened in the next 24 seconds was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing that looks clean in someone's memory afterward, all crisp movements and precise execution. It was fast, and it was brutal, and it was over before most of the people in the room had processed that it had started. The first man went down hard against a table, scattering glassware. The second caught Nathan's elbow across the side of his neck and folded. Numbers 3 and 4 came in simultaneously from opposite sides. Nathan let the one on his left get close, used his own momentum against him, put him into the floor, and came up to meet the fourth with a forearm that ended the engagement immediately. The coordinator at the east position tried to run. Nathan caught him in 3 steps, took his radio and his phone, and put him on the ground with far less force than the others because he needed this one functional. 5, 6, and 7 went down in a sequence that Nathan's body executed from a place in his nervous system that was much older than thought. The 8th man, the one who'd been at the bar, had drawn something, not a weapon, a phone. He was transmitting. Nathan crossed the distance, stripped the phone, and looked at the screen. 1 sent message, 4 seconds ago. Package still in play. Proceed. Nathan looked up at the ballroom. 300 people standing in absolute silence. Broken glass on 4 tables. 8 men in Meridian uniforms on the floor. The orchestra hadn't even fully stopped. One violin had continued out of reflex for a full 3 bars before trailing off. Victoria Sterling was on her feet, staring at him. Her own security team, the rear guard who'd been on his phone all night, was nowhere to be seen. The other 3 were standing at useless angles, hands raised in the particular way that meant they'd already been told by someone they trusted to stand down. Traitors inside. He'd expected that. Nathan looked at the phone in his hand, then at the exits, then at Victoria. "Ms. Sterling," he said. His voice was level. His ribs hurt, and his left hand had been bent in a direction it wasn't supposed to go, but that was a later problem. "We need to leave this room right now. Through the kitchen, not the main exits." She didn't move immediately. She was looking at him the way people look at something they can't categorize. Not with distrust exactly, but with the particular wariness of someone who has just watched an event that defied their understanding of what was possible. "Who are you?" she said. Nathan Cross. I'm a contract fill-in. I'm also the only person in this building right now who knows what's actually happening. He held up the phone with the sent message. This wasn't the whole operation. Whoever these 8 work for, they just got confirmation that you're still here, which means the second stage is already moving. She looked at the 8 men on the floor, at her own security team standing uselessly to her left, at the room full of guests who were starting to find their voices again, the murmur building towards something louder. Nathan watched her make the decision. It took maybe 3 seconds. He respected that, the speed of it, and the fact that she made it herself without looking to anyone else for permission. Kitchen, she said. Kitchen, he confirmed. They moved. Behind them, the ballroom erupted. Somewhere above the noise, Nathan could hear the elevator banks humming. The wrong elevators. Not the main car, which would have been moving between floors on its normal cycle. The service elevator. Coming up. He kept moving. The notebook in his pocket had 4 more pages that nobody had wanted to read 2 hours ago. Now he was the only one left who knew what was written in them. The service corridor behind the Meridian Grand's main kitchen was not built for 2 people moving fast. It was narrow, maybe 4 feet across, with exposed conduit running along the ceiling and wire shelving units bolted into the walls on both sides, loaded with backup linens, spare chafing dishes, and enough catering supplies to restock a small restaurant. The floor was sealed concrete, the overhead lights were fluorescent and humming, and every few yards there was a drain grate that caught the heel if you weren't watching. Nathan was watching. He was also watching the door they'd come through, the door at the far end, and the ceiling-mounted fire suppression heads, 3 of them, spaced irregularly, which told him this section of corridor had been added later than the original build, probably during a kitchen expansion. He noticed these things the way other people noticed whether it was cold outside. Victoria Sterling was keeping up. He'd half expected her not to. He'd seen enough executive protection work to know that people who spent their days in boardrooms sometimes fell apart the moment real chaos arrived. She hadn't fallen apart. She was breathing harder than she'd like, and there was a cut on her right palm from where she'd grabbed the edge of a prep table coming through the kitchen, and she was holding it against her hip without mentioning it. But she was moving, and she was thinking. He could see it in her eyes, the way they kept moving, processing, not just following him, but trying to build her own picture of what was happening. The stairwell at the end of this corridor, Nathan said, not slowing. It goes to the parking structure on 29. We bypassed the lobby. My security team, 3 of them were already standing wrong when this started. The rear guard was on his phone 8 minutes before the formation moved. He was told to step back. She was quiet for 3 steps. You're saying someone inside my team, at least one. Possibly the coordination came from higher. He pulled the confiscated phone from his pocket without stopping, kept it in his left hand, eyes forward. This device sent one message when I took it. Package still in play. Proceed. That message went to someone who then authorized a second stage. We have maybe 4 minutes before they figure out we're not in the ballroom. 4 minutes based on what? Based on the fact that whoever designed this operation was thorough enough to forge 8 security badges, disable 3 camera feeds, and compromise your personal detail, which means they planned for contingencies. A contingency for the ballroom going wrong would have a response time. He pushed through a swing door into the secondary prep kitchen, empty now, stainless steel surfaces catching the fluorescent light. 4 minutes is optimistic. Victoria followed him through. How do you know all this? You're a contract fill-in. You've been here for 6 hours. 6 hours. And you knew before any of this started? I told Fitch at 5:30. He wasn't interested. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Short and hard, and not remotely amused. Of course he wasn't. They reached the stairwell door. Nathan put his hand flat against it before touching the handle, checking for vibration, for sound on the other side. Nothing. He opened it 2 inches, looked down through the gap in the railing. The stairwell dropped away below them in a concrete spiral, emergency lighting only, the kind of flat orange glow that made everything look slightly wrong. He looked up, 1 floor above, a door, closed. No feet visible under the gap. He opened the door the rest of the way and moved them through. Keep your hand on the rail, he said. Don't use your heels on the stairs, step closer to the wall side. Less noise. I know how to walk quietly. Most people think they do. She gave him a look that would have been sharper in better lighting, but she moved the way he'd said. They made it down 4 steps before the door above them opened. Nathan had Victoria against the inner wall and his body between her and the stairwell opening before the footsteps had fully registered. He held his position, listening. 2 sets of feet, unhurried. The particular cadence of a 2-man team doing a sweep, methodical, not rushed, which was worse than rushed because it meant they weren't panicking. Above them, a voice, male, low, talking to someone through an earpiece rather than to the other person present. South stairwell, 32 to 31, negative on targets, moving to service level. A pause. Then, copy. The footsteps resumed, moving down, toward them. Nathan did the math in the space of about 1 second and didn't like any of the results. The stairwell was open enough that moving would create sound. The door behind them, back to the prep kitchen, would require him to move Victoria away from the wall, cross the landing, and get through a door that had a handle rather than a push bar, all of which added seconds he didn't have. The door below them, to floor 31, was 6 steps down and opened outward. He took Victoria's wrist, put his mouth close to her ear, and said one word. Down. They moved. Fast and as quiet as the stairs allowed, Nathan leading, Victoria's hand in his, 6 steps taken in the space of 3 seconds. He got the door open on the second try, the handle sticking once before it released, and they were through and into the 31st floor corridor before the sweep team had made it to the landing above. The 31st floor was a conference level. Dark now. The event had commandeered most of the hotel's staff for the floors above, and this level had been cleared of guests since 6 o'clock. The corridor stretched in both directions, doors to meeting rooms on both sides, the carpet muffling their footsteps in a way the stairwell concrete hadn't. Nathan let the door close behind them, held it for 3 seconds to slow the mechanism, then turned and looked both ways. Empty. For now. Victoria pulled her hand back, not roughly, just reclaiming it, and pressed her cut palm against her jacket again. 31st floor, conference level. There's an IT infrastructure room at the east end of this corridor. I had it built out 2 years ago. The hotel uses it for our events. It's keycard access. You have the card? She reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and produced a flat black keycard. I carry one for every Sterling Dynamics property installation. Habit. He looked at her. That's a useful habit. I've been locked out of my own rooms enough times to learn. She was already moving toward the east end of the corridor. There's a hardline terminal in there. If someone has been running an internal command network through this hotel's systems, there should be evidence of it in the router logs. You know how to read router logs? I built this company from a server rack in a converted warehouse. I know how to read router logs. She said it without particular heat, just stating a fact, the way you'd correct someone who'd assumed the wrong thing about your resume. Nathan fell in beside her. His left hand was throbbing now. The bend it had taken during the third engagement in the ballroom had been at the second knuckle, and the joint was swelling in a way that suggested he'd either sprained or fractured something small. He flexed it twice, decided it was functional, and stopped paying attention to it. The IT room was midway down the east corridor, not at the end. Victoria stopped at a door with no external marking, slid her card, and the lock released with a click that sounded very loud in the empty hallway. The room was small. Server racks on 2 walls, a workstation console in the center, ambient LED strips running along the floor. Blue-white, utilitarian. It smelled like electronics and recycled air. Victoria went directly to the console and woke the screen. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the fluency of someone who'd learned on hardware rather than in a class. Nathan positioned himself at the door, keeping it open 4 inches, watching the corridor. Talk to me, he said. There's an authenticated session that started at, she stopped. Typed something else. 1400 hours, 2 o'clock this afternoon. A device registered under a Meridian Facilities Management credential accessed this network and opened a VPN tunnel to an external IP. She pulled up another window. The tunnel is still active, which means someone is still monitoring through it, which means someone can see everything moving through this hotel's internal systems right now. She kept typing. Camera feeds, keycard access logs, radio channels. She paused. Elevator control. Nathan absorbed that. They know which floors are being accessed. They could know we came through the stairwell. If they're watching the keycard logs, they know exactly where my card was used. 32nd floor kitchen exit, 3 minutes ago. And she stopped again, and this time the pause was different, longer. And this room, 40 seconds ago. Nathan stepped back from the door and looked at her. How long to close the tunnel? I can kill the authentication credential from here, maybe 90 seconds. Do it. She was already doing it. Nathan let the door close, used a server rack's power strip housing as a rough wedge under the door handle. Not enough to stop anyone who really wanted in, but enough to give him 2 seconds of warning. Then he crossed to the console and looked at what Victoria had pulled up. The VPN tunnel log showed connection history, 31 separate access events over the past 9 hours. The external IP resolved to a shell address, routed through a commercial relay, which meant the origin was deliberately obscured. But the connection timestamps were regular enough that a pattern was visible. This wasn't improvised, Nathan said. No. Victoria's voice was flat. She was looking at the same thing. This took months. The tunnel credential is registered to a vendor account, Halcyon Technical Services. That company did AV installation work in this hotel 14 months ago. She scrolled down. The account was never deactivated, and for 14 months nothing happened with it. It just sat there. Until today. Until today. She killed the tunnel. The active connection indicator went dark. Nathan watched it for 5 seconds to confirm it stayed dark. It did. Halcyon Technical Services, he said. Is that name familiar to you? Any connection to Sterling Dynamics? Victoria had gone very still. I need you to answer that, Nathan said. Halcyon Technical Services. She said it slowly, like she was turning it over. We had a bid from a company by that name 18 months ago. Infrastructure Security Consulting. My head of security recommended them. We didn't ultimately use them. I didn't like something about the proposal. She paused. I couldn't have told you why at the time. The numbers were right. The credentials looked real. Something just felt off. Nathan thought about the man in the maintenance uniform, the badge with the slightly displaced stamp, the specific way he'd looked at the camera housing. Your head of security, he said, recommended them. Yes. What's his name? She looked at him. He watched her arrive at a conclusion she clearly didn't want to arrive at. Marcus Doyle, she said. Nathan had the notebook open before she finished saying it. He found the page. 522. Ballroom AV team. 3 personnel. 1 does not interact with equipment. Positioned near main fuse panel. He showed her the page, pointing to the line. This was one of your AV personnel. Positioned near the fuse panel the entire evening. Never touched equipment. Just watched the room. He flipped back 2 pages. The modified badges I flagged to Fitch, the disabled cameras, the guard rotation irregularity. He looked up. None of this reached Marcus Doyle. Gerald Fitch reports to Marcus. Does Marcus Doyle know about this room? Victoria's jaw tightened. He oversaw the installation. The door handle moved, not dramatically, just the small mechanical shift of someone trying a handle they expected to give. When it didn't, there was a pause. Then a sound that Nathan recognized as someone producing a key card. He had Victoria by the arm and moving toward the back of the room before the door opened. The server racks ran floor to ceiling on the east wall, creating a narrow gap between the back rack and the wall itself. Maintenance access, maybe 18 inches wide. Nathan got Victoria into it first, then positioned himself at the edge of the rack, back to the metal, watching the door. 2 men came in. Not the sweep team from the stairwell, different builds, different movement. These 2 were dressed as hotel staff. One of them was carrying what looked like a toolkit. The other had his hand inside his jacket in a way that wasn't about a toolkit. They crossed to the console. The one with the toolkit looked at the screen, then said something too low for Nathan to fully catch. 2 or 3 words. The other one pulled out a phone. Nathan didn't wait. The fight in the server room was shorter than the one in the ballroom and significantly less clean. The space worked against him. 2 steps in any direction put him into a rack edge or a cable bundle, and the man with the hand in his jacket was fast, faster than the ballroom crew had been. Nathan took an elbow across the side of his head that rattled his vision for a full second, which he used poorly, and then used the rack behind him as a brace to drive forward instead of trying to create distance he didn't have. 40 seconds. 1 man down, the other, the one with the phone, backed into the corner with Nathan's forearm across his collarbone and the specific understanding in his eyes that this had not gone the way it was supposed to go. The phone, Nathan said. The man let it go. Nathan looked at the screen without releasing pressure. 3 messages. 2 incoming, 1 outgoing. The outgoing one had been sent 11 seconds ago, just before Nathan had moved. Room compromised. Targets located. 31st. He stepped back. Looked at Victoria, who had come out of the maintenance gap and was standing with her back to the server rack. Her arms crossed in front of her, her breathing controlled. The cut on her palm had opened again, a thin line of red along the heel of her hand. "They know where we are," she said. "They knew where we were. We need to move again." He looked at the man in the corner, who was assessing his own chances and arriving at a realistic conclusion. The thermal devices in the building. How many and where? The man said nothing. "I already know about the thermal devices," Nathan said. This was a calculated bluff. He'd inferred their existence from the notation in his observation log about the man near the fuse panel, and from the pattern of what a second-stage operation designed to destroy evidence would require. But he said it like a man stating an inconvenient fact, not like a man fishing. "I'm asking you to confirm placement so I know how much time we don't have." The man looked at him for a long moment. Then, "I don't have placement details. I was running signals." "Who has placement details?" Silence. Nathan nodded, like the silence was an answer. In a way it was. "You were running signals, which means your authority ceiling is operational relay. The person who knows placement is above your level." He picked up the confiscated phone. "And he just got notified that you've been compromised." He looked at Victoria. "Is there another way to the parking structure that doesn't use the stairwells?" "There's a connecting bridge on 29, hotel to the office annex next door. From the annex you can reach the garage on 28. Access? My card should work. The annex is a Sterling Dynamics leased property." "Should." "Should," she confirmed. She wasn't pretending at certainties she didn't have, which Nathan appreciated more than she probably knew. He used a power cord from the downed equipment to secure the signals man to the server rack. Quick, functional, not gentle. Then they were moving again, back through the door into the corridor. The hall was still empty. For a few more seconds, anyway. They moved fast and without talking. Nathan kept the signals man's phone in his left hand, watching for incoming messages. 2 came in quick succession while they were crossing toward the west end of the corridor. The first, "Status?" The second, 30 seconds later. "Confirm status immediately." Nobody was confirming anything. At the west elevator bank, Nathan bypassed the cars entirely. Elevators were boxes with 1 exit, and someone with elevator control access could park them wherever they wanted, and found the access door for the connecting bridge that Victoria had described. Her card worked. The door opened onto a glass and steel walkway suspended between the hotel tower and a lower annex building. The city spread out below them through panels of floor-to-ceiling glass. 31 floors of downtown skyline lit against a sky that was fully dark now. Victoria paused for just a second at the entrance to the bridge. Nathan didn't stop moving, and she followed without prompting. Halfway across, she said, "You've been moving through this building like you designed it." "I walked it this afternoon. For 6 hours. For most of 6 hours. I was on post for the rest." She looked sideways at him. They were moving, still moving. "What did you do before contract security work?" Nathan kept his eyes forward. "Something else." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." She let it go, for now. He could feel her filing the question, setting it aside rather than dropping it, the way someone does when they've decided there'll be a better moment later. He'd been read that way before. People with enough intelligence and patience to understand that some answers came out on their own schedule. They reached the annex side of the bridge. Victoria's card opened the door. The annex was darker than the hotel. Older building, lower ceilings, the kind of fluorescent office lighting that had been replaced with LEDs in more recently renovated spaces, but still persisted here. It smelled like carpet cleaner and paper. Nathan stopped, listened. The building wasn't entirely empty. Somewhere below them, 2, maybe 3 floors, he could hear movement, footsteps with purpose, more than one person. "The garage access," he said. "Stairwell at the end of the hall, down 2 floors. How many people normally access this building after hours?" "Tonight? None. It's a data storage and admin annex, skeleton access only." Nathan looked at the signals man's phone again. No new messages, which meant either the other side was recalibrating or they'd switch to a different channel after the last relay went dark. Both options were problems. "Ms. Sterling." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. He turned to look at her directly, something he'd been partly avoiding because looking at her directly required him to also reckon with the fact that she was managing something genuinely terrifying with a steadiness that most trained people didn't maintain under this kind of pressure. "I need to know something before we go further." "Ask it." "The protocol they're trying to activate, the emergency executive authorization." He'd been piecing this together from the signals man's partial confirmation and from what the operation structure implied. The 8-person containment team designed to control rather than kill, the internal tunneling through corporate infrastructure, the way the attack had been staged to force compliance rather than eliminate a target. They need you alive and functional long enough to execute it, which means the clock they're on isn't about tonight. It's about whatever legal or technical window that authorization opens. Victoria's expression shifted. Not falling apart. She didn't do that. But something behind the controlled surface adjusted to accommodate a weight she'd apparently been carrying quietly. The Emergency Executive Protocol. It's a governance instrument, built into Sterling Dynamics Charter as a continuity measure. In the event the CEO is incapacitated or otherwise unable to discharge duties, executive authority transfers temporarily to a designated alternate, 72 hours, long enough to execute essential business decisions. And if someone controls who that authority transfers to, they control the company for 72 hours. She paused. With the access levels attached to that protocol, they could authorize asset transfers, technology licensing, the kind of licensing that moves intellectual property out of the company's legal protection and into a shell entity before anyone realizes it's happened. Nathan thought about the Halcyon Technical Services account, 14 months of a dormant credential. Whoever was behind this had been patient enough to plant a tunnel and wait more than a year for the right moment to use it. "How much is the core technology portfolio worth?" he said. Victoria looked at him with the flattest possible expression. "More than the building we're standing in, more than several buildings. And once the transfer executes, it's structured to be irreversible within the 72-hour window, designed that way to prevent hostile board interference. It's supposed to be a protection mechanism." She stopped. Someone understood exactly how to turn that protection into a weapon. Nathan heard the footsteps below them shift, the sound of a door opening, closer now. "We need to move," he said. "I know. And I need you to understand something." He was already turning toward the stairwell, already calculating the approach. "Whatever evidence we have from that server room, the tunnel logs, the Halcyon credential, the access history, that has to reach someone outside this building. Law enforcement. Federal level, not local, because local can be compromised just like your internal team was. I have a federal contact, SEC enforcement. We've dealt with her office before on compliance reviews. She's..." Victoria stopped herself from saying trustworthy, which was a good instinct. "She has no connection to Sterling Dynamics security infrastructure." "Good. Can you reach her from a phone that isn't logged to your account?" She looked at the signals man's phone in Nathan's hand. "Give me that," she said. He handed it to her without hesitation. She took it and did something with the settings that Nathan couldn't follow, then pulled up the dialer and entered a number from memory. 11 digits. She held it for 2 seconds, not hesitating, just timing something, then hit call and put it to her ear. They were at the stairwell door now. Nathan opened it, empty below. He gestured them through. The call connected halfway down the first flight of stairs. Nathan heard a voice on the other end, a woman's, slightly surprised at the hour and the unknown number. Victoria kept her voice low and steady as they descended, and what she said was not a plea or a panic. It was a structured brief. Building, floor range, protocol name, Halcyon Technical Services, Marcus Doyle. External IP address she'd apparently memorized while looking at the router log for 45 seconds. Nathan listened to her give that brief and revised several assumptions he'd been carrying about what kind of person he was dealing with. They hit the 28th floor and the garage access door, and Victoria was still talking, and Nathan was still watching the stairwell above and below, and in the parking structure beyond the door, something moved, headlights sweeping across the concrete ceiling, a car repositioning. And Nathan put his hand up flat. Victoria stopped walking, kept talking on the phone. Nathan looked through the small reinforced window in the garage door. One vehicle. Black SUV, engine running, parked at an angle that blocked the two pedestrian exits on the near side. A man leaning against the driver's door, arms folded, watching the structure entrance. Not looking for them, waiting for them. Nathan stepped back from the window, looked up the stairwell, then at the door beside the garage access, a fire equipment closet, if he was reading the floor plan correctly, which connected to a utility corridor that ran along the building's foundation level. He pointed to it. Victoria looked at where he was pointing, said two more sentences into the phone, and ended the call. "The utility corridor," he said. She handed the phone back. "The federal contact is moving." She said 20 minutes. 20 minutes? He looked at the garage door window again. The man by the SUV had shifted position, now facing more directly toward the pedestrian entrance, waiting for two people who were supposed to come through that door. 20 minutes is a long time. I know. We have at least 2 confirmed teams in this building that aren't the 8 from the ballroom. We have a compromised command channel that's been dark for about 7 minutes. And we have... He stopped. Looked at the signalsman's phone one more time. A new message had just come in, from a contact saved only as MD. He read it twice. "Stop looking for her. Bring him to me. Cross knows more than he's told her. I want to know how." Nathan stared at the name, MD, Marcus Doyle. And Marcus Doyle knew his name, which meant Marcus Doyle had known his name before tonight, before the ballroom, before any of this had started. Because nobody had called Nathan Cross by name in this building except Gerald Fitch during the afternoon briefing, and Gerald Fitch reported to Marcus Doyle. Nathan had walked into this hotel this evening as a fill-in contractor, a body on a roster, a name on a sign-in sheet, and someone had read that name and recognized it. He put the phone in his pocket, looked at Victoria Sterling, who was watching him with the particular attention of someone who had noticed that something had just changed in the room without being told what it was. "We're not just running from them," he said. "They're running something on me, too." He said it calmly because panic was a resource expenditure he couldn't afford, but he felt the cold settle into his chest the way it always had when something on an operation shifted from manageable to genuinely dangerous. Which changes the shape of this. It means whoever is behind this operation didn't end up with my name by accident tonight. They had it already. Victoria said nothing, waiting. Nathan thought about a pharmacy notebook in his jacket pocket, about a 7-year-old girl asleep with 2 missing front teeth and a drawing of a horse with 5 legs, about a phone he hadn't checked in 4 hours that probably had a goodnight text on it waiting to be read. "The utility corridor," he said. "Let's go." The utility corridor ran beneath the annex building like a forgotten vein, narrow, low-ceilinged, smelling of pipe insulation and old concrete dust. The lighting down here was emergency grade only, small amber fixtures bolted at intervals that did more to define the darkness than dispel it. Pipes ran overhead in bundles, labeled with faded paint markings that probably meant something to the maintenance crew and nothing to anyone else. The floor was uneven in places where the foundation had shifted over decades, and Nathan caught his footing twice in the first 30 yards without breaking stride. Victoria was behind him, close enough that he could hear her breathing, but far enough back that if he stopped suddenly, she wouldn't run into him. She'd figured out his pace within the first minute of moving together and matched it without being told. He noticed things like that, the way people adapted under pressure, what it said about how they normally operated. Victoria Sterling adapted fast and without complaint, which told him she'd been underestimated in rooms before and had learned to navigate around people's wrong assumptions rather than correcting them out loud. It was a quality Nathan understood personally. The corridor made a 90-degree turn, and Nathan slowed, checked the corner with a glance, then kept moving. Ahead, maybe 60 yards, a door with a crash bar and an emergency exit sign in red. He was mentally mapping the street-level position. The annex building sat adjacent to the hotel tower on the east side, which put this exit on the building's rear face, away from the main event entrance and the black SUV he'd seen waiting in the parking structure. Away from the obvious. Good. He was thinking about Marcus Doyle's message. Cross knows more than he's told her. The phrasing was specific in a way that mattered. Not Cross knows too much, which would be the language of someone managing a security leak. This was the language of someone who believed Nathan Cross had arrived at this gala carrying information. Prior knowledge. Which made no operational sense unless Marcus Doyle had a reason to believe Nathan's presence tonight was not coincidental. It wasn't coincidental, obviously. Nathan had been called in as a fill-in contractor last minute because someone else backed out of the roster. That was demonstrably random, but Marcus Doyle didn't know that, or didn't believe it, which meant Marcus Doyle knew Nathan Cross from somewhere else. Nathan pushed through the crash bar door. Cold air hit them both. The city at night, late autumn, the smell of exhaust and wet pavement. They were in a service alley behind the annex, dumpsters along one wall, a loading dock at the far end that was dark and unoccupied. Overhead, the hotel tower rose 32 floors above them, its upper windows lit with the ambient glow of an event that had by now descended into chaos. Nathan could only imagine from this distance. He stopped just outside the door, back against the exterior wall, and looked both ways down the alley. Empty. Quiet enough that he could hear the muted sound of sirens several blocks away. City noise. Might be relevant, might not be. "We can't stay in the open," Victoria said behind him. "I know." He was looking at the hotel tower, thinking about the 300 people still inside it. The guests who'd been in the ballroom when the coup started, who by now were probably being corralled by whatever portion of the hotel staff Marcus Doyle's operation had compromised. And Fitch, Gerald Fitch, who'd waved off every warning Nathan had brought him, who might be complicit or might just be a man who'd spent 6 years getting comfortable in a job that didn't require him to be sharp. He thought about the thermal devices, positioned, presumably, at structural or data-critical points throughout the building. A failsafe. Not meant to kill everyone. That would be too visible, too federal, too likely to bring the kind of scrutiny that would unravel everything before the asset transfer could be completed. The devices were meant to destroy evidence, server infrastructure, physical records, anything that could be used to trace the criminal network after the technology had been moved into the shell entities and the window had closed. 300 people in a building with thermal devices and a man willing to use them. Nathan had not stopped thinking about that since the signals man's partial confirmation in the server room. "There's someone still inside," he said. Victoria looked at him. "Besides 300 guests?" "Richard Holloway, your vice chairman." He'd been working through the Gala's attendee list from the briefing sheet, the one Fitch had handed out and Nathan had read twice in the security office before being sent to his post. "He was on the guest list for tonight. I didn't see him in the ballroom during the event, but that could mean he arrived late. If he's still in the building and Marcus's people know where he is..." "Richard knows everything about the emergency executive protocol," Victoria said. Her voice had changed, not louder, but more taut. "He's the designated alternate. His authorization, combined with mine, completes the transfer." "Is there a scenario where they execute the protocol without your cooperation?" She was quiet for 2 seconds. "If Richard authorized it under duress and someone forged or coerced my secondary authentication, yes. The system has verification layers, but if someone has had 14 months of internal access, those layers might already be..." She stopped. "Richard doesn't know any of this is happening. If Marcus has him somewhere in that building right now, then going back in is a question of when, not whether." He said it plainly, not dramatically, the way you state something that's already been decided. Victoria looked at him with an expression that said she'd arrived at the same conclusion and wasn't happy about it, but wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "I know where Marcus would hold him," she said. "There's a private conference suite on the 27th floor. It was part of Sterling Dynamics' event block reservation for tonight, completely separate from the Gala level, accessed by the South Elevator Bank only. If Marcus wanted somewhere inside the building that the hotel staff and event guests wouldn't wander into by accident, the 27th floor." "Yes." Nathan looked at the crash bar door they'd come through, looked down the alley, looked up at the tower. The sirens he'd heard earlier were closer now. His federal contact timeline, Victoria's call had been 9 minutes ago. 20 minutes total, she'd been told, which meant 11 minutes remaining and an unknown number of Marcus Doyle's personnel between them and the hotel's 27th floor. His ribs still hurt from the stairwell elbow. His left hand had stopped throbbing and started the deeper, more specific ache that meant the swelling had set in around whatever he'd fractured. His jacket had a tear at the shoulder from the server room, and there was dried blood on his collar that he was fairly sure wasn't his but couldn't fully verify. He thought about what Callie would say if she could see him right now. She'd probably say he looked like he'd fallen off his bike, because that was the worst physical state she had consistent reference for. The thought was so incongruous with the alley and the tower and the 11 remaining minutes that it almost made him smile. Almost. "South Elevator Bank," he said. We need a way in that doesn't put us through the main lobby or the parking structure. The loading dock at the end of this alley. It connects to the hotel's basement level, laundry and facilities. I had a meeting down there 2 years ago when the HVAC contractor needed sign-off. There's an internal stairwell that connects basement to 27 directly. It's a service route, not guest-facing. Nathan started walking toward the loading dock. You have an impressive mental map of this building for a CEO. I walked every inch of this hotel before I signed the event contract. She fell in beside him. Habit. Same habit as the key card. I like knowing where the exits are. He glanced at her. We have that in common. The loading dock was dark and unoccupied as he'd assessed from the alley. A rolling shutter gate was half closed, leaving a gap wide enough to move through without crouching. Nathan went through first, listened, then signaled Victoria through. The basement beyond was what he'd expected from her description. Industrial, functional, wide corridors meant for moving large equipment in laundry carts rather than people. The smell was detergent and steam. Fluorescent fixtures overhead, all of them working. They found the internal stairwell in 4 minutes, no encounters. Nathan wasn't optimistic enough to interpret that as good news. Empty corridors meant resources were concentrated somewhere else. And resources concentrated somewhere else meant whatever was happening on the upper floors had entered a phase that didn't require perimeter coverage at the basement level. They started climbing. Between the 14th and 15th floors, Victoria spoke. The message on that phone, Marcus used your name. Yes. You said it changed the shape of things. It did. I've been waiting for you to explain that. Nathan kept climbing. His footsteps were quiet and even. Marcus Doyle has been building this operation for, by your estimate, close to 10 years. He's inside your security infrastructure. He's had time to build files on anyone relevant to his operation, and when a fill-in contractor's name showed up on tonight's staffing roster, he recognized it. He paused on a landing, listened, kept going. That's the only explanation that fits. He knew my name before tonight. From where? This was the question he'd been carrying in his chest since the moment he read Marcus Doyle's message in the stairwell. And he wasn't ready to put it into words yet, because putting it into words meant saying out loud something he'd spent 4 years not saying. But Victoria Sterling had earned an honest answer, and they were 20-some floors into a building where being honest about the shape of the danger might be the difference between getting out and not. A name I'll tell you when we're not climbing, he said. Short version. I had a past before contract security work. Someone from that past is inside this building right now. She didn't push. She filed it, the way she'd filed the earlier question, and kept climbing. 27th floor. Nathan opened the stairwell door half an inch and looked through. The corridor was different from the floors below, carpeted, better lit, the aesthetics of a guest-facing conference level rather than a service space. He could see 4 doors on the visible section of hall. At the far end, partially visible around a corner, a pair of shoes and the lower leg of someone standing. Stationary. A posted guard. One visible. Probably not the only one. He let the door close silently and turned to Victoria. He held up one finger, pointed toward the end of the corridor, then held up 2 fingers and shrugged. One confirmed, possibly more. She nodded. He spent 30 seconds thinking about the corridor layout from memory. The briefing sheet had included a floor plan for the event block reservation, and Nathan had read it with the same completeness he read everything. The private conference suite Victoria had identified would be the largest room on this floor. The Ashford Suite, southwest corner, double doors, which put it at the end of the corridor where the guard's feet were visible, around that corner. One guard that he could see meant the primary security was inside the suite, not outside it, which meant whoever was in there was important enough to warrant interior protection rather than external cordon. Holloway was in that room. Nathan was as certain of it as he was of anything tonight. He opened the stairwell door fully and moved. The guard heard him at the same moment he saw him. A big man, mid-30s, military posture but private sector energy. The kind of man who'd done some form of service and then decided that the private side paid better. He had half a second to react before Nathan was on him, and half a second wasn't enough. Nathan took him down quietly. The man was unconscious before he finished sliding down the wall, and Nathan caught most of his weight to prevent the sound of him hitting the floor from carrying through the suite doors. He lowered him the rest of the way, took his radio and his key card, and straightened up. Victoria was already there, having moved through the door behind him without being told. She looked at the man on the floor, then at Nathan, with an expression that said she was still recalibrating her understanding of what Nathan Cross was, and that she'd stopped being surprised by the need to recalibrate. The suite doors were the double-door variety, solid, hotel-grade, not the kind that opened quietly without intention. Nathan used the guard's keycard on the electronic lock, got the green light, and opened both doors in one smooth motion. The Ashford suite was large, a conference table that seated 12 running down the center, a wet bar along one wall, windows on the south face with a view of downtown that would have been impressive in other circumstances. 3 people in the room, 2 of Marcus's men, one near the window, one positioned by the far door, both registering the entrance with the split-second assessment of men who were paid to assess things. And one man seated at the far end of the conference table, tie loosened, hands flat on the table's surface, looking at Nathan and Victoria with an expression that cycled through shock and relief in about 1 second. Richard Holloway. 63 years old, vice chairman of Sterling Dynamics, a man Nathan had placed from his briefing photo and could now confirm was both unharmed and not there by choice. There was a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched, and his jacket was on the table beside him rather than on his body, which meant he'd been sitting here long enough to take it off. Hours, probably. The 2 guards reacted at the same moment, which was good. Split reactions were harder to manage than sequential ones, but simultaneous reactions meant they were also partially in each other's way. Nathan went for the one by the window. He was across the room in 3 steps, using the conference table's edge as a line to run along, and the engagement was short and came out the way it needed to. The second guard got a hand on Nathan's shoulder from behind. Nathan let the grip close, then dropped his weight in a way that used the man's own pull against him, and that was over in 6 seconds. He stood up. His ribs screamed at him for the drop movement. He acknowledged it and moved on. Holloway was on his feet, one hand on the table for balance, staring. Who? Nathan Cross. Contract security. He crossed to the door on the far wall, checked it. Storage closet. Empty. He closed it. We have limited time, Mr. Holloway. Are you injured? No. Holloway looked at Victoria with the expression of a man who had spent the last several hours believing things were going to go very badly and was now struggling to update that belief. Victoria, how did you... Later, she said. She was already moving toward him. Richard, what have they told you? What did Marcus want you to sign? The sound of the name landed on Holloway like something physical. He sat back down, not because he meant to, but because his legs made the decision for him. You know it's Marcus. We know. Victoria pulled a chair out across from him and sat, leaning forward. What authorization language did he use? Exactly. He said it was an emergency continuity measure, that there was a credible threat to the company's leadership structure and the protocol needed to be activated as a precaution. He had documents. Holloway pressed his hands flat on the table, steadying himself. Looked legitimate. My secondary authentication form pre-filled with tonight's date. He said you'd already signed your portion remotely. I didn't sign anything. I know that now. Holloway's jaw worked. I told him I needed to verify with you directly. He said communications were compromised for security reasons and direct contact wasn't possible. When I refused to sign without verification, he said he'd give me time to reconsider and left 2 men with me. He looked at Nathan. That was 3 hours ago. 3 hours. Nathan did the math. If Holloway had been held since before the gala began, Marcus's timeline had started earlier than the ballroom event. The coup in front of 300 witnesses had been a simultaneous operation, not the primary one. The primary one was Holloway. The ballroom had been pressure, a visible display of force designed to panic Victoria into authorizing the protocol herself, while simultaneously cutting off her ability to communicate with Holloway and revealing that her cooperation wasn't coming voluntarily. A 2-front operation. Simultaneous. The kind of thing that required either a very large team or a very long time to plan, or both. Mr. Holloway, Nathan said, do you know about Halcyon Technical Services? Something moved across Holloway's face. Recognition, and behind the recognition, something older and more complicated. He looked at Victoria, then back at Nathan. Where did you hear that name? VPN tunnel in the hotel's IT infrastructure. 14 months of dormant access under a Halcyon vendor credential. Holloway was quiet for a moment that stretched uncomfortably. Then he said, I recommended Marcus Doyle for his position 9 years ago. He came with strong references from 2 prior security roles and an independent consulting background. He stopped. I didn't know about Halcyon until 8 months ago. I found a reference to it in a vendor payment record that Marcus's office had submitted. The amount was small enough that it would have passed routine review, but I happened to see the company name and I'd seen it before, in a regulatory filing that had nothing to do with Sterling Dynamics. He looked at his hands. I should have raised it immediately. I didn't because I wasn't certain and because He paused. I'd recommended Marcus. His failure would have been my failure. Victoria was looking at him with an expression that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it. The look of someone absorbing information they wish they'd received sooner and are choosing not to say that out loud right now because the moment doesn't allow for it. It doesn't matter right now, she said, though her voice said it mattered. What else do you know about Halcyon? It's a holding structure. At least 3 shell companies beneath it. The beneficial ownership is obscured through a cascade of registration jurisdictions. But the operational pattern, the way contracts were structured, the way payments moved, matches a network that was flagged in a federal securities investigation 7 years ago. He looked up. The investigation was closed without charges when the primary target was killed in an overseas incident. Some kind of contract gone wrong, the way I understood it. Nathan went very still. The ambient noise of the room continued around him. Holloway's voice, the distant hum of the building's climate system, Victoria asking a follow-up question he didn't fully hear. He was somewhere else for a moment, in a way that happened sometimes when something collided with a specific memory at high speed. 7 years ago. A federal investigation closed without charges when the primary target was killed. The primary target hadn't been killed. The primary target had walked away and changed his name and taken a lower-profile contract security role and gotten very careful about the footprint he left in the world, for reasons that had nothing to do with self-preservation and everything to do with a 7-year-old girl who drew horses with 5 legs. But someone connected to that network, the network that had been investigated and then quietly closed, had resurfaced inside Sterling Dynamics. Had been inside Sterling Dynamics for 9 years, the same number of years as Marcus Doyle's tenure. Nathan made himself come back to the room. Mr. Holloway, he said. His voice was level. He was good at level. The investigation 7 years ago, the network that was flagged. Do you know the operational name it was working under at the time? Holloway thought. It was referenced in the filing as the Ardent Consortium. The word hit Nathan in the sternum like a closed fist. He kept his face still. He was very good at keeping his face still. Ardent. He'd heard that name in a different context, a different life. Heard it in a debrief that happened 4 days after a mountain road in a country he didn't think about anymore, where a convoy he'd been protecting had driven into an ambush that should have been impossible given the security protocols in place. Heard it again in a classified report he wasn't supposed to have read, but had read anyway, standing in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, while a doctor he'd never met before told him that the volunteer medic in the convoy's 3rd vehicle had not survived. His wife, Sarah Cross, who had been 34 years old and had been there because she believed the work mattered, and because she'd never once in their 11 years together let fear make decisions on her behalf. He had spent the years since that day building a wall between himself and the name Ardent, the way you wall off a room in a house that burned. It was still there. He just didn't go in. Marcus Doyle had gone in. Victoria was watching him. She'd seen the stillness and the thing it covered, and she was watching him with the focused attention of someone who had decided not to speak until he was ready. He was quiet for 15 seconds. Then, Ardent is the network behind this, and Marcus Doyle has been their access point inside Sterling Dynamics for 9 years. He looked at Victoria directly. They didn't just find your company by accident. Sterling Dynamics' technology portfolio represents something they've been positioning to acquire for a long time. Long enough to plant someone at the executive security level and wait. The same network, Victoria started. The same network has come up in my life before, he said. Short, direct. Not volunteering more than that, not yet, because the rest of it lived in that walled-off room, and he wasn't going to open that door in a conference suite on the 27th floor of a hotel with a federal response 11 minutes away. Maybe 8 minutes now. What matters right now is that Marcus Doyle knows that, and he's looking for me specifically, which means this operation hasn't gone exactly the way he planned it. That's an understatement, Holloway said. It also means Marcus is going to move faster. He knows his timeline is compromised. He knows we're in the building, or he knows Victoria is, and he can assume I'm with her. Nathan looked at the radio he'd taken from the guard in the corridor. He'd been monitoring it in his peripheral awareness throughout the conversation. No transmissions on this channel, which meant either it was a dead frequency or the operation had shifted to an alternate. He suspected the latter. The thermal devices. He planned them as a clean exit, destroy the evidence trail, complete the technology transfer in the chaos of an emergency response. And by the time anyone reconstructs what happened, the assets are already in shell entities. He paused. But he didn't plan for us to get this far, which means he might move to activate the devices before the transfer is complete, if he decides evidence destruction is more valuable than the prize. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Victoria said, "Where's the primary trigger for those devices?" "Not a remote detonation. Too easy to intercept or block. For something like this, a standalone countdown controller. Something that can be set and walked away from." He thought about the man he'd noted near the fuse panel during the gala, the AV team member who never touched equipment. That man would have been positioning, not activating. The activation would happen from somewhere the signal had guaranteed physical access. Server infrastructure level. The hotel has a dedicated communications room, usually between floors 20 and 25 in a building this size, because of cable routing. 22nd floor, Victoria said immediately. The hotel's primary comms room is on 22. I know because our event tech team had to coordinate with it for the gala's AV setup. Nathan looked at her. She looked back. I know what you're thinking. What am I thinking? That you need to get to 22 and that I'm safer somewhere else. Yes. And I'm going to tell you that I'm not leaving Richard alone, and I'm not leaving this floor until I know what's happening. And if you try to tell me to wait somewhere while you go be the hero, I'll follow you anyway and be less useful doing it. Nathan considered that. Considered her. The cut palm. The composure that had not cracked once in the 90 minutes since the ballroom. The way she'd given the federal brief from memory while descending a stairwell. Then we move Holloway to the stairwell, and you keep him there, he said. Door locked, no radio transmission, no movement until federal response arrives. If I'm not back before they come through, you'll be back, she said. Ms. Sterling, if I'm not back before federal response arrives, you tell them everything from the beginning. The tunnel logs, the Halcyon credential, Marcus Doyle's name, the Ardent network, everything. And you? I'll be on 22. Holloway stood. His jacket was still on the table. He picked it up and put it on with the precise movements of a man pulling himself together. He looked at Nathan with an expression that Nathan didn't know how to read for a moment. Something complicated, weighted, the look of someone who had made an error of omission that had cost people something they couldn't afford to pay. I should have said something 8 months ago, Holloway said. Nathan picked up the guard's radio and key card. You're saying it now, he said, and moved toward the door. The corridor was empty. The guard he'd put down was still where he'd left him. Nathan moved him into the stairwell, not gently, but not with anger, just efficiently, and propped the suite door open long enough for Victoria and Holloway to follow. Victoria was the last through. She put her hand briefly on the stairwell door frame, the cut palm against the metal, and Nathan didn't know if it was steadying herself or something else. She didn't explain it, and he didn't ask. 20 minutes from the call, she said. That was 12 minutes ago. 8 minutes, Nathan confirmed. Can you do what needs doing in 8 minutes? He looked up the stairwell, then down it. 5 floors below, in a communications room he'd never been inside, was a countdown controller that might already be running. And somewhere in this building was Marcus Doyle, a man who knew Nathan's name and the name of a network and the shape of a loss that Nathan had spent 4 years converting into a quiet life of school pickups and pharmacy notebooks and overnight security contracts. I don't know, he said. It was the honest answer. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Something in her face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite resolve, but was the specific combination of the two that people arrive at when they understand exactly what they're facing and choose to face it anyway. Then go find out, she said. Nathan went down. He took the stairs down fast, one hand on the rail, the other carrying the guard's radio. 5 floors. His ribs were a steady, low-grade fire on his left side, and his fractured hand had stopped hurting in the way that meant the body had run out of bandwidth to keep reporting it. He registered both things and kept moving. The 22nd floor stairwell door had a different resistance than the others. Slightly heavier, the kind of door that had been retrofitted with additional ceiling, probably for fire rating reasons tied to the communications infrastructure behind it. Nathan opened it slowly, leading with a 2-inch gap, listening before committing. The corridor here was different from the floors above and below. Narrower. No carpet, just sealed concrete painted gray. 2 overhead fixtures, both working. On the left wall, a series of data cable management panels. Gray metal housing units bolted at regular intervals, running the length of the hall. On the right, 3 doors, all closed. The furthest one had a thin strip of light visible at the floor. Nathan let the stairwell door close behind him without sound. He moved along the left wall, using the cable panel housings as visual breaks, closing the distance to the lit door. No voices. No radio traffic. The kind of quiet that was either empty or occupied by someone disciplined enough to hold it. He stopped at the door. Steel frame, no window. A standard keycard reader mounted at shoulder height. He tried the guard's card. Red light. Different access tier. He'd expected that. Communications infrastructure at this level would have its own credential set, separate from the general hotel keycard system, which meant either finding another way in or making a decision about the door. He made the decision about the door. The frame gave on the third application of force, the locking mechanism shearing at the bolt housing rather than the card reader side. Loud. One hard sound that he couldn't control and didn't try to. He was through the gap before the door had fully swung open. The communications room was longer than he'd expected. Racks of networking equipment ran floor to ceiling on both sides, leaving a center aisle maybe 3 feet wide, cables bundled overhead in dense, organized runs. The air was cold, precision climate control, constant, the kind of system that ran 24 hours to keep hardware at operating temperature. At the far end of the aisle, a secondary workstation console, its screen active. And in front of the console, a man Nathan had never seen in person but had spent enough time thinking about in the last 90 minutes that recognizing him felt almost inevitable. Marcus Doyle was taller than the file photos Nathan had mentally constructed from the security briefing sheet in Holloway's description. 60s. Lean in the way of someone who'd maintained physical conditioning as a professional discipline rather than a personal preference. Gray at the temples. Wearing a dark suit that had held its shape across what had clearly been a complicated evening. He had his hands behind his back, which was either a posture of calm authority or a way of keeping them visible to someone he'd heard coming through a door 30 feet away. He turned at Nathan's entry without apparent surprise. "I wondered if you'd come here or try the roof," he said. His voice was even. Conversational, almost. The voice of a man conducting a meeting he'd scheduled. The roof was the other option I'd prepared for. But this felt more likely, given your training background. Nathan stayed in the aisle entrance. 7 feet of racks on both sides of him, 1 exit behind him, 1 man in front of him, and on the console screen at Marcus's back, a timer display running numbers Nathan could read from this distance. 11 minutes and 43 seconds. 42. 41. "The devices are already running," Nathan said. "They've been running for 20 minutes. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "When my signals team went dark on the 31st floor, I made a judgment call. The technology transfer window is closing faster than I'd prefer, but evidence destruction remains viable." He paused. "You and Ms. Sterling have been remarkably productive for a fill-in contractor and a CEO who, until tonight, had no idea how compromised her own security infrastructure was. She figured it out faster than you expected. You figured it out faster than I expected. She had good instincts. She rejected the Halcyon proposal 18 months ago, which was an inconvenience I'd planned to work around. But you—" Marcus looked at him with an attention that felt like the wrong kind. Focused, long. "You walked into this building this afternoon and produced 4 pages of documented irregularities within 6 hours. That is not the behavior of a man who happened to take a fill-in contract because he needed extra income. I'm observant." You were a Navy SEAL for 15 years. 3rd Special Operations Group. You were the primary protective detail lead on a classified convoy mission 7 years ago in a country that doesn't come up in your publicly accessible service record. Marcus said it without inflection, like reading from a document. Your wife was a civilian volunteer medic attached to that convoy, Sarah Cross. She died in the ambush. Nathan's jaw was tight. The rest of him was very still. I know what happened to that convoy, Marcus continued. I know because I was part of the network that sold the route information. Not the primary broker. I was a secondary relay, far enough removed from the transaction that the federal investigation never reached me. He paused. I have carried that knowledge for 7 years, Cross. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it didn't cost me anything, because I'd be insulting your intelligence and mine. Then don't tell me that, Nathan said. What I will tell you is that I have something you've wanted since the day it happened. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper. He held it up, not extending it, just displaying it. Complete operational roster. Every name in the Ardent network who was involved in the authorization chain for the route sale. From the field relay all the way to the broker who took the contract. 12 names, including the 2 who are still active. He held Nathan's gaze. You've spent 7 years not being able to find those names. I can put them in your hand right now. Nathan looked at the paper, looked at the timer on the console behind Marcus. 11 minutes, 4 seconds. He thought about Sarah, not in the abstract, specifically the way she'd looked 2 days before the convoy departure, standing in the kitchen of their apartment on base, eating cereal at 7 in the morning because she'd forgotten dinner, telling him about the medical supply chain problem she was trying to solve for the volunteer program, talking with the particular focused energy she had when something mattered to her, the way she'd waved him off when he'd said he was worried about the mission parameters. You worry about your people. I'll worry about mine. That's how this works. He thought about Callie, who had Sarah's eyes and Sarah's habit of talking through problems out loud, and Sarah's complete indifference to whether the people around her thought her ideas were too ambitious. He thought about 11 minutes. Here's my offer, Marcus said. Walk away from this room. Leave the building. Whatever federal response Ms. Sterling has arranged arrives, finds a building where the communications infrastructure has experienced a significant but non-lethal fire event, recovers the guests who are currently quite safe on the upper floors, and begins an investigation that will take, conservatively, 2 to 3 years to produce actionable results, by which time the Ardent Network's assets are restructured through jurisdictions that don't cooperate with federal subpoenas. He tilted his head. In exchange, you get the 12 names. You get closure. You get the thing you've actually wanted since you left the military. Nathan looked at the paper for another 2 seconds. Then he looked at Marcus Doyle, and something in his expression must have answered the question before he spoke, because Marcus's posture shifted. Not much, but enough. No, Nathan said. Marcus absorbed this. The people in this building are the reason I'm saying no. Not the only reason, but the first one. Nathan began moving down the aisle. The devices, what's the control architecture? Standalone controller, you set and walked away, but there'll be a manual override. Show me. Marcus didn't move. I'm not going to show you. Then we're going to do this the hard way and lose time we don't have. Cross, the names on that paper, Nathan said, still moving, are not worth 300 people in a building, and even if they were, even if I could make myself believe that, those names don't bring Sarah back. They don't give Callie her mother back. They give me something to do with my anger, and my anger is not the point. He was 6 feet away now. The point is, my daughter grows up knowing her father didn't make the wrong call when it was hard. That's the only thing I've got left to give her that matters. Marcus looked at him for a moment that Nathan couldn't fully read. Something moved across the older man's face. Not remorse exactly, but something in its neighborhood. He'd been in this business long enough that remorse had probably been replaced by a functional substitute that looked similar from a distance. Then Marcus moved. He was fast for his age and faster than Nathan had fully credited, which was a mistake Nathan registered in real time as a forearm came up and caught him across the left shoulder, spinning him into the rack on his right. Metal edge caught his ribs, the already damaged left side, and the sound Nathan made wasn't quite a word. He got his feet under him before the second strike landed, let it push him backward rather than absorb it, and used the momentum to get distance. 3 feet of aisle. racks on both sides. No room to maneuver, which was equally true for both of them. Marcus had training, the kind that showed in how he stood, weight distributed, hands up and open. Not combat sport training, not gym training. Something older and more pragmatic, the kind you acquired in fieldwork and retained the way you retained a language you'd spoken for years. Nathan assessed this in the 2 seconds before Marcus came at him again. The second exchange was worse than the first. Marcus was willing to take damage to deliver it, which was the tactic of a man who understood that his opponent's physical state was already compromised. He absorbed a hit to the shoulder and turned it into a clinch, driving Nathan backward into the console workstation, and the edge of the console caught Nathan across the small of his back in a way that sent something electric down his left leg. Nathan grabbed the rack beside him for balance, pulled himself back in, and changed approach. He stopped trying to create distance. In a 3-foot aisle, distance was the wrong goal. He went close instead, inside Marcus's preferred range, which was the range where the older man's technique was effective, and made the fight smaller and less technical than Marcus wanted it to be. Close enough that skill mattered less than endurance. Nathan's endurance was not good tonight, but Marcus Doyle was 62 years old and running an operation that had been under sustained pressure for the last 90 minutes, and whatever his conditioning level, there was a ceiling. They found the ceiling. It took 4 more minutes, which was 4 minutes Nathan didn't have, and it ended with Marcus on the floor between 2 server racks, one arm pinned, breathing in the specific way of a man who had found his limit and was acknowledging it without language. Nathan straightened up. His left leg had mostly come back. His ribs were a problem he was going to deal with later. He looked at the console. 9 minutes, 16 seconds. He crossed to the workstation. The controller interface was on a secondary screen beside the main console, standalone hardware, exactly as he'd anticipated, with its own power supply and a manual input terminal. The countdown was running on an isolated system, which meant killing the building's power wouldn't stop it. He needed the override code, which would be in the controller's own memory, accessible through the hardware terminal. He looked at the interface. It was a system he didn't recognize by brand, but the architecture was familiar, the kind of modular countdown and release hardware that had been common in industrial demolition and specialty infrastructure work for 2 decades. He'd seen variants of it, never operated this specific model. The override, he said, without turning around. 6-digit code. Tell me. Marcus said nothing. Marcus. Nathan's voice was level, but the level was costing him something now. There are 300 people in this building. Whatever you think about me, whatever the operation was supposed to accomplish, this is the part where you decide what kind of man you actually are, not the kind you've been for 9 years. Right now, this decision. A long silence. Then, from the floor between the racks, 4, 7, 1, 9, 2, 6. Nathan entered it. The countdown stopped at 8 minutes 51 seconds. The screen shifted to a confirmation state, override accepted, and then to a system status display showing 7 device nodes, all flagged as deactivated. Nathan looked at each node status for 3 full seconds, making sure none were running on a secondary trigger. All 7 showed clean. He let out a breath he hadn't been fully aware of holding. Behind him, Marcus made a sound. Not pain, something else. Nathan turned. Marcus was trying to get up, using the server rack as a brace, and his left hand had come down on an exposed section of cable management where the housing had cracked at some point during the fight. A section of wiring was bare at the edge, and as Marcus's hand gripped the metal brace beside it, the position was wrong, his palm too close to the exposed conductor, and the rack's power draw was live. Nathan covered the distance in 2 steps. He pulled Marcus away from the rack by the back of his jacket, hard, and Marcus came down on the floor again without grace. Nathan checked his own hands, dry, insulated by his jacket sleeve where it counted. Then checked Marcus, who was looking at his palm with the slightly unfocused expression of a man who had received a shock and hadn't fully arrived back yet. "Your hand," Nathan said. Marcus looked at him. The unfocused expression cleared slowly, replaced by something Nathan still couldn't categorize. It wasn't gratitude. Men like Marcus Doyle didn't do gratitude cleanly. It was something more like genuine confusion, as if the math of what had just happened didn't resolve into a result he had a framework for. "You could have let that happen," Marcus said. "Yes. After everything." Nathan sat back against the opposite rack, because his leg wasn't entirely reliable and he needed a moment. Letting you die in here doesn't give me anything I want. It doesn't fix anything. And I'm not going to explain that to you any further because it's not a complicated concept. Marcus was quiet. The radio on Nathan's belt, the one he'd taken from the corridor guard, crackled for the first time since he'd entered the floor. A voice, male, clipped. All units, federal law enforcement entering the building, main lobby, south entrance. All units. A pause, some distortion. Stand down now. Nathan listened to the transmission until it finished. Then he looked at the ceiling, where the climate control hummed its steady note, and the server racks blinked their green and amber status lights. And 8 minutes and 51 seconds of a countdown that would have destroyed this place sat inert on a screen behind him. I thought about the notebook in his jacket pocket with its 4 pages of observations that nobody had wanted to read at 5:30 this evening. He thought about Gerald Fitch eating a sandwich. He thought about the convoy road, and a third vehicle, and a morning in a hospital corridor. He thought about a horse drawing with 5 legs. He was still sitting against the rack when footsteps came down the corridor. Fast, organized, the particular cadence of a federal entry team. He kept his hands visible. That was habit, and habit was what kept you alive in the moments when thinking was too slow. The door came open. 4 agents, tactical gear, weapons up. Behind them, 2 more. Nathan looked at the lead agent and said, "Nathan Cross, Contract Security. The countdown controller on the secondary console has been overridden. 7 thermal devices, all deactivated. The man on the floor is Marcus Doyle, Head of Security for Sterling Dynamics. He's the operations primary." The lead agent looked at Marcus, looked at Nathan, looked at the console. "The CEO," the agent said. "27th floor, Ashford Suite. She has Richard Holloway with her, Sterling Dynamics Vice Chairman, both unharmed." He paused. "Tell her the devices are down. She'll want to know that first." The agent relayed into her radio. Nathan listened for the acknowledgement and heard it. Then he let his hands drop and sat there on the floor of the communications room while the agents moved around him. Securing Marcus, checking the console, doing the things that came after the part he'd been responsible for. His ribs were going to be a real problem tomorrow. Probably 2 fractures, based on the specific location of the pain and the way the breathing caught on the left side. His hand would need imaging. The thing in his lower back from the console edge would resolve on its own in a week. He was alive and functional, which was the standard he'd been working to. His phone was in his inside jacket pocket. He'd been 5 hours without checking it. He pulled it out now. Cracked screen, he didn't remember when that had happened, and looked at the notifications. 7 texts from Mrs. Adeyemi. The first 3 were routine. Callie had eaten dinner, Callie had done her reading homework, Callie wanted to stay up for 1 more chapter, and Mrs. Adeyemi had said yes because the chapter was short, and the book was the one about the girl and the horse ranch, which they'd both agreed was worth the exception. The 4th text was different. She asked me when you're coming home. I said midnight. She said to tell you she saved you the last of the chocolate biscuits. She also says you have to take her to school tomorrow because she wants to show you something she made. I said I'd pass it along. Nathan read the text twice. The 5th, 6th, and 7th were variations of Mrs. Adeyemi checking in as the hours had passed his expected return time. The tone escalating incrementally from practical to mildly concerned in the specific register of a woman who was too experienced to panic but too careful not to notice. He typed back, "I'm okay. Ran long. Home by 2. Tell her I'll be there for school." He looked at the sent message for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and stood up, slowly, holding the rack for balance once and then not needing it. Across the room, 2 federal agents were processing Marcus Doyle, hands secured, Miranda language, the procedural machinery of an accountability that was going to take a long time to fully resolve but had definitively begun. Marcus was cooperating, which surprised Nathan less than it might have. Men who'd planned this carefully didn't tend to make things worse for themselves in the arrest phase. They calculated what cooperation could yield, and they made the calculation. The folded paper with the 12 names was on the floor of the aisle, where it had fallen during the fight. Nathan looked at it. An agent was already moving toward it as a piece of evidence. "That document," Nathan said. The agent looked at him. "It's relevant to a federal investigation that predates this one by 7 years. 3rd Special Operations Group convoy incident. The names on that paper are principals in the network behind it." He kept his voice even. "It needs to go to the right people, not lost in evidence intake." The agent looked at him for a moment, then nodded and bagged the paper separately, marking it with a notation. Nathan watched her do it and didn't feel what he'd spent years imagining he'd feel when the ardent network names came into the light. He felt something, but it wasn't satisfaction, and it wasn't relief. It was closer to the feeling of setting something heavy down after carrying it for a long time. Not better, exactly. Just different. A different kind of weight distribution. He walked to the door. An agent stepped aside to let him through. In the corridor, more federal personnel were moving, organized, purposeful. He could hear the sound of additional teams working through the floors, the coordinated process of extracting 300 guests from a building that had, as of 9 minutes ago, stopped being the danger it had been 2 hours before that. The radio crackled again. A different voice. Female, clear. Ballroom level secure. Guests being moved to primary stairwells for evacuation. 8 detained in ballroom, 12 additional personnel detained on floors 28 through 32. We're looking for the contractor, Nathan Cross. Nathan unclipped the radio and pressed the key. Cross here, 22nd floor, communications room. I'm mobile. A brief pause. Then Victoria Sterling's voice, on the same channel. She'd gotten a federal radio somewhere, or she'd simply asked for the microphone, which Nathan decided was more likely. Nathan. Just that. His name, in a voice that had held itself together for 2 full hours and was now doing the particular work of continuing to hold together even though the acute pressure had passed, which was often the harder part. Devices are down, he said. All 7 nodes confirmed deactivated. Building safe. A silence that lasted long enough to carry something in it. I know, she said. They told me. She stopped. I wanted to hear it from you. Nathan looked down the empty corridor. At the cable management panels on the wall. At the 22nd floor of a building that was still standing because a fill-in contractor nobody had taken seriously had walked it for 6 hours and written 4 pages of notes that had eventually turned out to matter. I'm on my way up, he said. He clipped the radio back to his belt and started for the stairwell. His pace was slower than it had been going down, not because he'd lost urgency, but because the urgency had served its purpose and his body was beginning to submit its bill. 5 floors up, Richard Holloway was going to need to answer for 8 months of silence about a vendor name, and that conversation was going to be hard and necessary. I was talking in the careful, measured way of a man who had made a decision to be fully honest and was now discovering that full honesty, after 8 months of partial silence, required more words than he'd anticipated. Victoria was in the corridor. She was leaning against the wall beside the suite door, arms crossed, her jacket gone. She'd given it to someone or set it down somewhere between the stairwell and here and hadn't retrieved it. The cut on her palm had been wrapped with what looked like a strip torn from a hotel hand towel, white gone slightly pink at the center. She was looking at the floor when Nathan came off the stairwell landing, and she looked up at the sound of his footsteps. She looked at him the way people look at someone they weren't entirely sure they'd see again. You're limping, she said. I'm walking, he said. There's a difference. She pushed off the wall and came toward him, stopping at a distance that was closer than professional but not quite personal. The ambiguous middle ground of 2 people who had spent 2 hours keeping each other alive and hadn't yet figured out what category that put them in. She looked at his ribs, at his hand, at the tear in his jacket shoulder. The devices, she said, all down, 7 nodes, all confirmed. The agents have the controller in evidence. Marcus. Federal custody. He's cooperating. Nathan paused. He gave me the names. The Ardent Network roster. Everyone involved in the convoy ambush. It's in evidence now, bagged separately, flagged for the prior investigation. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She wasn't going to ask if he was okay with that. She was smart enough to know that okay wasn't the right word and might never be, and she respected him enough not to reach for it. What she said instead was, "Is it enough?" He thought about that honestly. It's what it is, he said. It won't feel like anything for a while, maybe a long while. But the right people have the names now, and that's... He stopped. That's more than I had this morning. She nodded once. Something in her expression that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but was close to both. The look of a person absorbing a night that had taken more from everyone in it than the morning had suggested it would. From inside the suite, Holloway's voice continued its careful accounting. Nathan looked through the door at him. He's going to have a hard few months. Yes. Victoria followed his gaze. He should have come to me 8 months ago. I know that, and he knows that. And right now I can't decide if I'm more angry about the time we lost or more. She stopped herself, recalibrated. He was trying to protect his own record. People do that. Doesn't make it right. She paused. He's been with this company for 22 years. He built our governance structure. He's a good man who made a bad call under the wrong pressure. She looked at Nathan. I'm going to be angry at him for a while, and then I'm going to have to figure out what comes after that. That sounds about right, Nathan said. Down the corridor, more federal personnel were moving through. The systematic work of a major operation being fully secured, evidence collected, personnel processed. Someone in a dark jacket with a federal ID on a lanyard stopped at Nathan's position and asked him 3 quick questions: his name, his role, whether he needed medical attention. He answered the first 2 honestly and said no to the third, which was not entirely accurate but was accurate enough for right now. The agent moved on. Nathan looked at his phone. 1:47. A text from Mrs. Adeyemi at 1:32. I see the news. Are you all right? Please text back. He texted back. I'm all right. Home by 3 at the latest. I'll be quiet coming in. Her response came in under a minute. I'm not asleep. Take your time. She's fine. He put the phone away. Victoria had been watching him do this, not intrusively, just with the peripheral awareness of someone who'd spent a night reading small signals. Your daughter, she said. She saved me some biscuits. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Not amusement exactly. Something warmer than that and less simple. How old? 7, 8 in February. What's her name? Callie. Victoria said the name quietly, just once, like she was placing it somewhere. Then, you told Marcus that keeping her clear on who you are was the only thing left that mattered. You heard that? The radio. She held up the federal radio she'd been given, which Nathan had forgotten she had. I heard most of the last part of it. He wasn't entirely comfortable with that, but he wasn't going to pretend he hadn't meant it. It's true, he said simply. I know. She looked at the radio in her hand, then set it on the windowsill beside her. My father died when I was 9. He'd built something, not as large as this, a small engineering firm, 12 employees. When he died, the people he'd trusted most spent the following year dismantling it for parts. My mother had no idea what the company was actually worth or what protections should have been in place, because my father hadn't wanted to worry her with that level of detail. She paused. I started Sterling Dynamics at 26 because I wanted to build something that couldn't be taken apart by the wrong people after I was gone. And I spent 20 years making it harder to penetrate and never once considered that the vulnerability was inside the perimeter. She looked at Nathan. Marcus was inside the perimeter, not because I failed to build the walls high enough, because I trusted the person I'd put in charge of the walls. Nathan didn't offer her a reassurance because she wasn't asking for one and wouldn't have believed a clean one anyway. What he said was, the walls weren't the problem, the audit process was. You had one person with unchecked authority over security infrastructure for 9 years and no independent verification layer. I know. That's fixable. I know that too. She looked at him in the particular way she had, direct, with the sense of someone assessing not just what was in front of them, but what it implied. I'm going to tell the full story, publicly, all of it, the breach, the length of the exposure, what Marcus was doing, and for how long. I'm not going to manage the narrative or let the PR team soften the edges. Nathan looked at her. That'll be expensive. It'll be expensive. She said it without flinching. It'll cost the stock price, probably cost me 2 board members who'd rather manage disclosure, and it'll give every competitor in our space a window to move into while we're dealing with the fallout. She paused. And it's the right thing to do. People who work for this company and people who invest in it deserve to know what was done to it and how far it went. She shook her head slightly. I spent 20 years building something I said was about more than the profit margin. If I manage this story to protect the profit margin, I've been lying about what it's actually about. Nathan had been in rooms with executives before. Boardrooms, briefing rooms, the particular category of expensive hotel conference suites where decisions were made from behind layers of advisors and legal counsel and strategic communications teams. He'd watched the way people in those rooms calculated every word against its cost and every action against its optics. He had not often seen someone stand in a hallway at 2 in the morning and say out loud, without qualification, that they were going to do the expensive right thing. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "Okay?" "I believe you'll do it." A short silence. Then something in her expression that was not quite a smile but was the direction of one. High praise. "It's what it is," he said, echoing his own words from earlier without intending to. She heard the echo. The not quite smile stayed. Down the corridor, one of the federal agents called Nathan's name. They needed a formal statement, a recorded account of the evening's timeline, from his perspective, beginning to end. He told the agent he'd be there in 2 minutes. The agent nodded and moved back to a staging position near the elevator bank. Nathan looked at his watch. Almost 2. He thought about the school performance in the morning. Callie had said she'd made something. She'd been working on a project for her class for 3 weeks, something she'd been deliberately vague about, which meant it was either very ambitious or she wasn't sure it would work and didn't want to have to explain if it didn't. He'd promised to be there. "I have to give a statement," he said to Victoria. "I know. And then I have to go home." "I know that too." She straightened up from the wall. Her posture was the same it had been all evening, composed, upright, the bearing of someone who'd decided a long time ago that how you held yourself when things were hard was a choice. "Nathan." She said his name the way she had on the radio, direct, like it meant something specific to her now that it hadn't 7 hours ago. "I want to bring you back in, not tonight, obviously, not to talk about this building or this case or what Marcus did. 3 weeks from now, when the federal phase is active and my board is arguing about what comes next." She paused. "I need someone to rebuild the security infrastructure from the ground up, not patch the existing system, rebuild it. New protocols, new audit structures, new personnel vetting, everything, with full authority and no ceiling." Nathan looked at her. 90 days, she said. "Acting Director of Executive Protection. After 90 days, if you want out, you walk with a full fee and whatever recommendations you want. If you want to stay..." She left that open. "I'm not going to pretend I know what this looks like long term. I'm asking for 90 days and honest work." He thought about the staffing agency, about last-minute fill-in contracts and pharmacy notebooks and overnight rates that covered 2 months of after-school care, about the fact that his car needed new brakes and he'd been putting it off for 6 weeks because the timing hadn't been right. He thought about what Victoria had just said in that hallway, about walls and audit processes and unchecked authority, about the fact that she'd said it without anyone asking her to and without anyone watching except him. 3 conditions, he said. She waited. "Every security decision I make is documented and available to an independent oversight function. No black boxes, no discretionary budget lines I control without review. I want the audit structure visible." Agreed. "No risk gets classified as acceptable because disclosure would hurt the company's position. If there's a threat, it gets reported internally at the right level regardless of the optics." Agreed. "Nothing except a genuine emergency, my definition, not yours, prevents me from keeping promises I've made to my daughter, school performances, parent meetings, the things I tell her I'll be there for. Those are non-negotiable." Victoria was quiet for a moment, not hesitating over the condition, processing it, Nathan thought, understanding what it meant that he'd put it third, after the structural conditions, but still in the list of things he required before he'd say yes. "Agreed," she said, without qualification. He looked at her. She looked back. In the corridor of the 27th floor of the Meridian Grand Hotel, at 8 minutes past 2 in the morning, with federal agents moving through the hallway around them and a statement waiting to be given, and a night that had cost everyone in it something they wouldn't fully tally for weeks, Nathan Cross said, 3 weeks. "I'll come in." She nodded once, the way she'd nodded in the kitchen corridor when she'd decided to trust him, early in the evening, when she hadn't had any real evidence that she should. A decision made from the available information, accepted fully once made. He went and gave his statement. It took 40 minutes. The agent was thorough, good instincts, organized questions, the kind of interviewer who listened to the answer before formulating the next question rather than running a script. Nathan walked her through the afternoon from the moment he'd arrived at the service entrance, the 4 pages of the notebook, the conversation with Fitch, the ballroom, the corridor, the server room, the utility tunnel, the annex bridge, the 27th floor, the 22nd floor. All of it in sequence. I was precise about timings and honest about the moments he'd been uncertain. When they reached the section about Marcus's offer, the 12 names, the proposed exchange, the agent paused the recorder and looked at him. He offered you the names in exchange for walking away. Yes. And you declined. Yes. The agent looked at him for a moment with an expression that was doing something complicated behind her professional neutrality. Then she restarted the recorder and continued with the next question. She didn't ask him why. He appreciated that. He left the Meridian Grand at 3:14 in the morning. The city outside was the specific version of itself that only existed between 2 and 4 a.m. The version that had given up the performance of daytime and was just existing. Traffic lights cycling through their colors for nobody in particular. The occasional cab moving through intersections at a pace that felt almost meditative. Nathan's car was in a parking structure 4 blocks from the hotel, where he'd left it at 4:15 the previous afternoon, which felt like something that had happened in a different part of his life. He sat in the car for 2 minutes before starting it, not falling apart, not processing dramatically, just sitting, letting the quiet of the car be quiet. The kind of pause that happens between a thing ending and the next thing beginning. Not empty, just suspended. He thought about Sarah, which he tried to do at least once a day, and which he didn't always manage. He thought about the 12 names in a federal evidence bag, and what would eventually happen with them, which was going to be a long process, and one in which he would probably be called to testify, and which he wasn't going to let himself think about tonight, beyond acknowledging that it existed. He thought about the moment in the communications room when Marcus had said, "I have carried that knowledge for 7 years," and about the fact that carrying it had not changed what Marcus had done or given him any reason to think it mattered to Marcus the way it should have mattered. He thought about the difference between a man who carried guilt like a justification and a man who carried it like a debt. He thought about Callie's horse drawing. Then he started the car and drove home. Mrs. Adeyemi was awake in the living room armchair when he came in, a book in her lap, the floor lamp on low. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him for 4 years, with the particular combination of affection and assessment that she'd never once had to explain because it was always clear what it meant. She was 61 years old and had raised 3 children and had been widowed at 54 and had developed in the intervening years an extremely accurate ability to read what a person was carrying when they walked into a room. "You look terrible," she said. "I feel about average," he said. She set the book down and looked at his jacket, at his hand, which he'd been favoring without fully realizing it, at the general condition of him, which was the condition of a man who had taken a significant amount of physical damage over the preceding 8 hours and addressed exactly none of it. "Hospital," she said. Tomorrow. "Tonight." "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll go in the morning before the school performance. I'll have time." She looked at him with the expression of a woman who knew she wasn't going to win this particular argument and had decided to register her position clearly for the record rather than expend effort on the outcome. "She woke up at midnight," she said, "asked if you'd called. I said you had." "You told her I called?" "I told her you were fine and working late and that you'd sent your love." She picked up her book again. "It was true enough. She went back to sleep in about 4 minutes." She paused. "She's been sleeping with that drawing in her bed, the horse one she sent you." Nathan stood in the middle of his own living room and didn't say anything for a moment. "Go see her," Mrs. Adeyemi said, without looking up from the book. "You don't have to wake her, just go see her." He went down the hall. Callie's room was the second door. They'd painted it together when they'd moved into this apartment 2 years ago, a color she'd called the right kind of green, which was a specific sage that had taken 4 sample swatches to find. There were drawings taped to the outside of the door, replaced periodically as new ones were completed, and the current collection included a cat that appeared to be riding a bicycle, a self-portrait that was more impressionistic than realistic, and a drawing of 2 people standing next to what Nathan had eventually understood was supposed to be a very large sandwich. He opened the door quietly. The room was dim, the small nightlight in the corner, the glow of the street coming through a gap in the curtain. Callie was asleep on her side, one arm tucked under her pillow, her hair in the loose braid Mrs. Adeyemi always did for school nights. On top of the covers beside her hand was a folded piece of paper. The tablet drawing, printed out, the horse with the enormous head and the 5 legs and the firefighter's hat. Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment, He didn't think about anything complex or important. He just looked at his daughter sleeping in her room in the right kind of green and listened to her breathe and understood, not for the first time and not in any way he could have articulated to another person, that this was the thing he had always been moving toward and away from and back toward again. Not a destination he'd arrived at and could now rest in. A choice he made every day about what was worth coming home for. He pulled the door closed behind him and went back to the living room. Mrs. Adeyemi had her coat on. "I'll see myself out," she said. "Ice the hand." She looked at him once more at the door. "You did something good tonight." "I did what needed doing." "Sometimes those are the same thing," she said, and let herself out. He iced the hand and didn't sleep much. 3 weeks passed in the way that weeks pass after a significant event. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the particular texture of time that is full of necessary things. There were federal interviews. There were lawyers. There was a morning when Nathan sat in a conference room with 3 attorneys and a federal investigator and answered questions about the convoy mission for the first time in 7 years, in any context that was official and recorded, and it was harder than he'd expected, and also, in a way he couldn't fully explain, slightly easier than carrying it alone had been. The 12 names in the evidence bag became 12 names in a sealed federal indictment that was reported in the financial press as a significant development in a long-running investigation into a private security contracting network. Nathan's name was not in the press coverage. He preferred it that way. Victoria held a press conference 11 days after the gala. She stood behind a podium in Sterling Dynamics headquarters lobby with no prepared statement, answered every question directly, disclosed the full scope of Marcus Doyle's access and the length of the breach, named Halcyon Technical Services, described the emergency executive protocol vulnerability, and spent 45 minutes being asked things she could have declined to answer and didn't decline. The stock dropped 7 points in the 2 days following. 3 analysts downgraded their recommendation. 1 board member resigned. None of that changed what she'd said or how she'd said it. Richard Holloway submitted his resignation the same week. Victoria declined it. She accepted instead a formal censure, a reduction in executive authority pending a governance review, and a commitment that Holloway would cooperate fully with every aspect of the federal investigation. He did. The 8 months of silence cost him, professionally, publicly, in the particular way that omissions cost people more than clean mistakes often do. But he stayed, and he testified, and he did not try to minimize what he'd sat on or why. Marcus Doyle was charged on 14 federal counts. His cooperation with investigators, which had begun in the communications room and continued through the federal intake process, resulted in the kind of cooperation agreement that prosecutors offer when the information provided exceeds what they could have assembled independently. The Ardent Network's financial architecture, the shell companies, the jurisdictional cascade, the beneficial ownership structure, was being systematically unwound by a task force that now had documentation it hadn't had before. Nathan did not follow the case closely. He followed it enough to know it was moving. That was sufficient. On the morning 3 weeks after the gala, Nathan drove to Sterling Dynamics headquarters for the first time as something other than a fill-in contractor. He'd been here before, twice, years ago, in a different professional context. But the building had the quality that institutional spaces often have of being familiar in its structure and entirely changed in what it means depending on why you're in it. The lobby was marble and glass, a large atrium with a reception desk and security gates, and in the center of the floor, an abstract sculpture that Nathan didn't have a strong opinion about, but that Callie, when he described the building to her, had immediately decided was probably a horse if you look at it right. He told her she was probably right. The security gates were staffed by 3 people. The 6th was Victoria, at the head of the table. She was in a dark jacket and no jewelry except a watch. Her hair was back. The cut on her palm had healed enough that she wasn't favoring it. She looked like a person who had slept at some point in the last 3 weeks, though not as much as they should have. When Nathan came in, the room did something that rooms do sometimes when a person enters who the room already has a context for. The CFO and the general counsel had clearly been briefed on who Nathan was, and their briefing had given them a version of the gala night that was accurate but probably not complete, because nobody who wasn't there could fully reassemble it from the outside. They looked at him with the particular attention of people trying to match a file to a person. The interim head of operations looked at Nathan with something more complicated. He'd been doing someone else's job for 8 days in the aftermath of someone else's 9-year betrayal, and the person walking through the door was going to have authority over a department he'd been covering, and he was handling that with reasonable grace, which Nathan acknowledged internally. Holloway looked at Nathan the way he had in the Ashford suite after the agents arrived, the look of a man still making his accounting. Nathan sat down. Victoria said, "Thank you all for being here. I'll keep this short because Nathan has actual work to start, and the orientation details are in the materials Priya distributed." She looked around the table without lingering on any one face. "Nathan Cross is joining us as Acting Director of Executive Protection for a 90-day term, with full authority to assess, restructure, and rebuild the security infrastructure from the ground up. His decisions in that domain don't require my approval to implement, though I expect to be kept informed. I want everyone in this room to be clear on that authority structure." She paused. "Questions about the scope of this role should go to Nathan directly, not to me." The CFO asked one question about budget authorization thresholds. Nathan answered it in 2 sentences. The General Counsel asked one question about the documentation structure for security decisions, and Nathan told him about the independent oversight function he'd made a condition of taking the role, and the General Counsel wrote something down. The interim head of operations looked at Nathan and said, "What do you need from my team first?" Nathan looked at him. He appreciated the directness. "A full personnel file on every security staff member currently employed, with their original background check documentation, and the access log for every keycard credential issued in this building for the past 18 months. I can have that by end of day. This morning would be better." The man nodded without visible irritation. Good instinct. "This morning," he said. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, the executives filtered out. The federal liaison stayed for a brief follow-up conversation with Victoria, and Holloway paused at the door. He looked at Nathan. He'd been looking for the right words for this moment, Nathan suspected, for 3 weeks. What he said was, "I want you to know that what I withheld wasn't about not caring about the people in this company. It was about, I was afraid of what it would mean, about my record, about—" He stopped. "That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. I just want you to understand that it wasn't indifference." Nathan looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. "People protect their records because they're afraid of what it says about them if they got something wrong. That's human. It's also expensive, and you know now exactly how expensive." He paused. "The question going forward isn't what you were afraid of then. It's what you do with the next thing you're uncertain about." Holloway absorbed that. Nodded once, the way a man nods when he's heard something he needed to hear and isn't going to pretend it didn't land. Then he left. Victoria walked the federal liaison to the elevator and came back. The conference room was empty now except the 2 of them. She stood at the window. The city below, the late morning light coming in at an angle that caught the glass buildings across the street and scattered across the conference table in long rectangles. "How's Callie?" she asked. "She was good this morning." He'd made it to the school performance, barely, the hospital imaging having taken longer than he'd planned. 2 confirmed rib fractures and 1 confirmed finger fracture confirmed in exchange for 2 hours and a lecture about not waiting longer. He'd arrived 4 minutes before Callie's part. She'd been performing a piece she'd written herself. A short story she read aloud about a girl who discovered that her neighborhood's apparently abandoned building was actually full of animals who'd organized a small society and had very strong opinions about trash collection policy. It was strange and specific and very funny and entirely her. Afterward, she'd said, "You actually came." Not accusingly, but with the particular relief of a child who has learned that adults sometimes mean what they say and is still surprised when it happens. He'd said, "I told you I would." She'd said, "I know, but still." He'd held that still with him for 3 weeks. "She performed a piece she wrote," Nathan said to Victoria, "about animals who run a neighborhood." Victoria smiled, a real one, not the controlled kind she used in professional contexts. It changed her face significantly. "Was it good?" "It was very strange and completely wonderful," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then out at the city. "I've been thinking about what you said to Marcus, about Callie growing up knowing her father didn't make the wrong call when it was hard." She was quiet for a second. "My father made some of the wrong calls. Not in any dramatic way, but he was a good man. But he made choices about what to tell people and what to protect people from, and I think he believed he was managing things. And what he was actually doing was making sure that when he wasn't there anymore, nobody around him understood what they were standing in. She paused. I don't want to run this company that way. I want the people in it to understand what they're standing in. That's a harder way to run a company, Nathan said. Yes. She looked at him. But it's the way that doesn't blow up when one person with unchecked access decides to monetize his position. Nathan thought about Gerald Fitch eating a sandwich, about 4 pages of notes in a pharmacy notebook that had taken most of a night to be worth anything to anyone, about a propped open fire door in the lobby that he was going to have documented and corrected before the end of the day. I'm going to need to look at the lobby door, he said. Victoria raised an eyebrow. The fire door left of reception. It's propped open. Has been since I came in. He looked at her. That's the kind of thing that becomes normal because nothing's happened yet, and then something happens. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Go." He went. He spent the rest of that morning walking the building, all 38 floors. Not in a hurry, not running a checklist in any dramatic way, just moving through the spaces the way he always moved through them, with the full attention of someone who understood that the ordinary details were where the real vulnerabilities lived. Not the sophisticated tunnel through a hotel's IT infrastructure. Not the 8 men in forged uniforms. Those were the elaborate versions. The fire door. The camera with the obstructed angle. The guard rotation that nobody had audited in 2 years. Those were where it started. He had a new notebook. Not from a pharmacy this time. Callie had given him one, 3 days after the gala, without much explanation beyond "you probably need it." It had a green cover, the right kind of green, and she'd drawn a small horse on the inside of the front cover in ballpoint pen. This one with only 4 legs and a slightly more proportionate head, which represented meaningful artistic development. He wrote in it as he walked. Times, locations, the things that didn't fit and the things that were just close enough to find that they'd probably been overlooked for years. On the 19th floor, he found a camera housing with a viewing angle that had been blocked by a relocated partition wall. The partition was probably moved during an office reconfiguration, and nobody had adjusted the camera, which meant there was a blind spot in front of the secondary server access door that had existed, based on the wall's paint age, for at least 18 months. He wrote it down. On the 26th floor, he found a keycard reader that accepted his credential when, by the access tier architecture the General Counsel had described. It shouldn't have. His level didn't include access to the legal archive room, but the reader passed him through anyway. A credential permission error. The kind of thing that happens during system updates when someone doesn't check the role assignments afterward, and the kind of thing that, if someone had known about it, could have been exploited for access to files. Nobody wanted exploited. He wrote it down. By the time he came back to the 34th floor in the early afternoon, he had 7 pages. He looked at them in the elevator and thought about the 4 pages in the pharmacy notebook that nobody had read until too late, and about the fact that the difference between those 4 pages and these 7 wasn't what was written in them. It was whether the person reading them understood what they were looking at. His job, for 90 days and possibly beyond, was to make sure the people in this building understood what they were looking at. Not a hero's work particularly. Not the kind of thing that looked like anything from the outside. Mostly, it was going to be meetings and documentation and careful conversations with people who'd been doing things a certain way for a long time and needed to understand why a different way mattered. It was going to be resistance and bureaucratic friction and moments where the right call was the one that cost someone something they hadn't budgeted for. It was going to be imperfect because organizations were imperfect and people were imperfect, and the best you could build was something honest enough to catch its own mistakes before they became someone else's crisis. Nathan Cross understood imperfect work. He'd been doing it his whole adult life. His phone buzzed at 2:47. He looked at it. Callie, are you coming home for dinner? He looked at the message for a second, looked at the 7 pages of notes, looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city in the afternoon light, the skyline he'd been moving through for 4 years of contract work and overnight shifts and pharmacy notebooks, and one night in a hotel that had turned out to be the hinge between one version of his life and whatever came next. He typed back, "Yes. What do you want?" The response came in 12 seconds. Tacos, obviously. He put the phone in his pocket, picked up his notebook, went back to work. There is a specific kind of man. not celebrated for it, not often recognized until something goes wrong and he turns out to have been the only one paying attention, who measures his worth not in what he's accumulated, but in what he's protected. Not the dramatic protections, not the ones that end in 8 people on a ballroom floor and a countdown timer frozen at 8 minutes 51 seconds, the ordinary ones, the daily ones, the keeping of promises made to a 7-year-old girl about dinner and school performances and being home before the important things started. Nathan Cross was not a simple man, and his life was not a simple life. And the thing he'd lost at 33 on a mountain road in a country he didn't say out loud had left marks that weren't going to fade into nothing. That was the truth of it, and he didn't pretend otherwise, not to himself and not to the handful of people close enough to see it. Grief was not a problem to be solved. It was a shape that the people you'd loved left behind, and you carried it not because you couldn't set it down, but because setting it down entirely would mean losing the last precise outline of them. And that was a trade nobody asked you to make. What he'd found, not that night in the hotel, not in the 3 weeks after it, but in the accumulated weight of the ordinary days, was that carrying what he carried didn't have to mean standing still. It didn't have to mean closing off. It meant you moved through the world with more weight than some people did, and you learned where to put it so that it didn't crush the things still living. Callie was still living. 7 years old and furiously making art about animal governments and losing her teeth and having very specific opinions about which pasta shapes were acceptable and which were not. And she needed a father who came home, who kept the promises, who sat at the table for tacos on a Tuesday without checking his phone, who showed up to the strange and wonderful performances and afterward said, "I told you I would," like it was simple, but because for her sake, it needed to be. That was the mission, the one that didn't end, didn't get a debrief, didn't resolve in a federal courtroom or a press conference or a conversation at 2 a.m. in a hotel corridor. It renewed every morning, quietly, without ceremony, and it was the one he was most afraid of failing at, and the one he was most committed to not failing at. And the difference between those two things was where he actually lived. He left the building at 6:03. The evening air was cool, the city moving around him in its ordinary way, and he walked 4 blocks to his car with the new notebook in his jacket pocket, and 7 pages of things to fix and somewhere north of here, in a specific apartment in the right kind of green. A 7-year-old who had saved him some biscuits and expected tacos, and did not know, and would not know for many years, exactly what her father had done the night the city's lights had all been on, and almost everything had gone wrong. She just knew he came home. That was enough. That had always been enough. And for the first time since he'd left the battlefield and started keeping the smaller, harder promise, the daily one, the one that didn't ask for courage in any dramatic way but asked for it constantly in every ordinary way, Nathan Cross believed, without forcing himself to, that it was going to keep being enough. He drove home.